is a concept I think about quite a bit. I don't know how you were, but I lived in the same house for a while when I was a kid, but then it was just like place to place to place. We lived in a bunch of different houses. Especially with divorce, you end up in a bunch of different houses because if both parents are moving a lot, you end up in different places. So home is a thing I think about a lot. And home is one of those things that, because I think about it a lot, I like to ask people where they're from, and I like the answers. And like some people will tell you their favorite place that they've lived, that's home. And some people will say, well, this is where I was born. Especially military kids who've moved around a lot. When they tell you where they're from, they generally are not telling you where they were born, right? They're telling you where was the place that they enjoyed being the most. And so when you think about home, I don't know what that is for you. Maybe it's the place that you grew up. Maybe it's the place that you're the happiest. I don't know what it was. When I think about home, honestly, I think about Northwest Arkansas, even though I didn't live here until I was 23. I think about Northwest Arkansas. We lived in all over Independence County and in that area. And Brittany moved around a bunch of different places. She answered that question for herself. And then we were married while we were living in Little Rock, separate homes, but we were married. We were both living in Little Rock. And we lived there for the first year and a half, but Little Rock is not a place I think of as home. It was when we got to Fayetteville that we really built a life for the first time. It was where we were adults away from school for the first time, bought our first house, did all those things. And when we moved to Columbia, like the place we wanted to come back to, though, wasn't Fayetteville. It was just Northwest Arkansas. That was our place. This is our home. And when we tell people, ask where you're from, like this is what we tell people, where we're from. This is home. And I don't know what it is for you, but that's what it is for us. You say, why does any of that matter? Because the way that you think about home or the place that you think of as home determines your behavior, and it determines what you think is odd, right? Some church planners in Indiana came and stayed with us for a while, and we ordered pizza while they were there, and they asked where the nacho cheese was. I'm like, what do you mean where the nacho cheese is? Apparently in Indiana, that's a thing, right? They've got the nacho cheese that comes with the pizza. You order a pizza, you get nacho cheese, and they're strange people. But because that's where they're from and that's the way they do it, that's what they think of as normal. That's what they think of as acceptable behavior, although it's not acceptable at all. When we were in Columbia, there was a lady that wanted to make dinner for the whole church, and it was a very small church, so that was easy. And she said, she made chili, and she got really upset. I was like, what's the matter? She said, I forgot the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I'm like, well, the kids can just eat chili. I don't understand the problem. But apparently, for them, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are the things that you eat with chili. Miss Linda, is that how y'all do it in Iowa? No, that's just strange Missouri behavior. What you think of as normal behavior is based on what home is like. And when you go somewhere that's not home, you see the way that people act, and it's different. Home sets your reality for you. When Paul talks in Colossians, what he's trying to do with them at the end of Colossians chapter 2 and the beginning of Colossians chapter 3 is to get them to realize where home is for them. This is how he ends Colossians 2. We talked about this last week. Verse 20, if you have died to the elemental spirits of this world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? If this world is no longer your home, why do you act like it is? Before, you were trying to have a relationship with God based on your behavior. You were trying to keep these rules so that God would be happy with you, because that's what everybody in your home does. That's the way your home operates. But if that's no longer your home, why do you act like that? Why do you act like that is your home? He begins Colossians chapter 3, and you got to remember that when he wrote these, he wasn't saying, where should we start the new chapter? Like there was, the Bishop of Canterbury came up with all that junk. It was not, none of the writers were writing this. So he was expecting you to read all the way through. So he says, if you have died, then why? And then in chapter 3, he says, if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above. And so if this world is not your home, then why do you still act like it is? But if heaven is your home, then start acting like it is. Because home determines what you think is acceptable. Home determines what you think is normal. Home determines the way that you act. That's what home sets for you. If you have been raised with Christ, if heaven is your home, then seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on the things of earth. If heaven is your home, then act like it. Think about the priorities of heaven. Think about the way that things are done in heaven. Think about what's acceptable in heaven and what's not. Where is home for you? And if home is heaven for you, why do you still act like this is home? And Paul says, I want you to act like heaven is your home because, verse 3, you have died and your life is hidden with Christ. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory, that we are all sinners, that we all deserve death and separation from God. And we have religious systems that are based on this earth. We have denial of pleasure. We have rules that we keep. We have do this and don't do that so you can make God happy. That's the way that things are here. But those of us who have recognized that we cannot do enough to make things right with God on our own, but we need Jesus to do that for us, and we've trusted in Jesus to do that for us, and we've cried out to him to do that for us. If we are no longer bound by the way that things are there, but we have hidden our life with Christ, we have died with him and been raised with him, then let us live like that's true, like our home is in heaven. And that is difficult. It's difficult to live like your home is somewhere else because it means that you behave strangely. It means that you think about things strangely. It means that when you order a pizza and it doesn't come with nacho cheese, you are disappointed because this world is not your home. I want to show you a couple of pictures just to kind of illustrate what it's like to live as if somewhere else is your home. Dennis and Linda went to the UK to experience that whole thing for a couple years. Was that 2 years ago? And they liked it so much the government wouldn't let them leave. That's not a joke. They got COVID while they were over there and had to stay extra time, and I think they got all of the place they could handle. Dennis did, at least. He said he's not leaving the country. But so this is a picture of them in Cornwall. I believe this is looking over the Celtic Sea. I didn't ask for sure. I'm just using my own geographical knowledge. This is them looking off of it, and this is not their home. They're in another place where things are different. Let's go on to the next picture there. This is just Dennis. And he's eating fish and chips. He's there in Cornwall, and he is out of his element, but he's enjoying being out of his element. It's a different kind of place. But there is something that sets Dennis apart, although he is all the way over there. Can y'all see what it is? Go on to the next image there. Look at that right there. Dennis is never in here when I talk about him. I don't know why. It doesn't matter that he is on another continent where nobody understands what a red pig indicates. It doesn't matter that he is in a place eating food that's different than what he eats. It doesn't matter that he is not home. He still lives as if he's in Arkansas. He's still got that pride going on. And it doesn't matter where you are, his home is still Arkansas. It doesn't matter what the British think about the pig on his shirt. It doesn't matter whether Linda's embarrassed about what he's wearing or not. It doesn't matter to him. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks because his home is Arkansas and he will live like his home is Arkansas regardless of where he is. How does that set him apart? Doesn't really matter to him. How does that draw attention? Doesn't really matter to him. What do other people think about it? Doesn't really matter to him because Arkansas is his home and he will live like it. And while Paul is not saying anything about athletic gear, what he is saying is that your home, if your home is in heaven, it should be obvious to everybody because you live as if this is not your home. I texted Dennis and Linda and said, do y'all have pictures of Dennis wearing a Razorback in the UK? And they're like, yeah, I knew that was a safe guess. He says, I want you to live as if this world is not your home. How do we do that, though, Paul? How are we supposed to do that? It sounds great. I completely agree. Good idea. How do we do that? Well, that's what the rest of the verses are for. I want to read this to you, what he says, and this is just the beginning. We're going to work through this chapter over the next few weeks. But this is what he says, starting in verse 5. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. And these you too once walked when you were living in them. But now you must put them all away, anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge after the image of its Creator. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. Now you might be thinking to yourself, if you've been here and been paying attention, Ben, we just talked about how you're not supposed to have a list of rules that you follow, but then you just gave us a new list of rules to follow. What's going on? Well, there is a difference here. If you think back to the things that Paul has talked about in chapter 1 and chapter 2, he's talked about the keeping of holidays, he's talking about the keeping of the Sabbath, he's talked about the foods that you eat, the things that you drink, the containers that you drink from, and how you're obsessed with these things. But the list that he gives us is not a list of do this, don't do that. The list that he gives us is not a list of these specific items to do or not do, but the list that he gives us are qualities of who we should be and who we should not be. It's not about, hey, in this situation you can do these, and as long as you can do these, you can get away with whatever else you want. But this is the kind of people you should be. Why? So this is the new system that we use to earn our salvation? This is the new system that we use? No. You've died to that system, so now that you're alive in the new things, you do this because heaven is your home, not to try to make heaven your home. You put these things to death. These are not specific actions. These are qualities about who you are and the way that you think about things, the way that you identify things. Jesus said it this way when he was talking to the scribes and Pharisees. This is how he talked about it. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 25, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, and that the outside might also be clean." The list of rules that he's talking about, these systems that are created to try to make you right with God, they're washing the outside of the cup. He says, I'm not interested in you washing the outside of the cup, because if you wash the outside of the cup, but the inside of the cup is still dirty, I'm not using it. I'm not going to drink out of that cup. Who cares how it looks on the shelf? I care about the inside of the cup. I care about it being clean. And when Paul talks to them, you get the first half of this book is stop cleaning the outside of the cup to try to look clean. And the last half of the book is clean the inside of the cup so that you will actually be clean. And if you will clean the inside of the cup, then the whole thing will be clean. And we, as believers in the 21st centuries, we specifically as Baptists have a really hard time focusing on being clean on the inside rather than clean on the outside. We like to follow all the rules so that we look good, but in the inside we just push all that stuff down so that nobody knows about it, right? And you know how I know that's us? Because you think about the jokes about us. What's the difference between a Baptist and a Methodist at a liquor store? The Methodist will say hi to each other. That's the difference. Because you think this thing is wrong, and so you only do it where nobody else will know about it. And if you see somebody else doing the same thing that you're doing, you just don't acknowledge each other so you can continue to pretend. A phrase that drives me crazy is, you can't do that in church. Well, if you can't do it in church, you can't do it at all, guys. Like, you can't say that in church. He's the preacher. Don't say that around him. Guys, if you only sin and you think it's acceptable to do something that you consider sinful, whether it's sinful or not, but you consider it the wrong thing to do, and so you won't do it at church or you won't do it around me, you are cleaning the outside of the cup. And as long as the outside is clean, you're fine. We have to be really careful about this. And when I read this book of Colossians, that's why I've titled this whole thing A Letter to Us. When I look at the things that Paul says to us, says to them, he could easily be saying it to us. So the first half of the chapter is understanding the gospel, or the first half of the book is understanding the gospel. For the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at what it looks like to live as if heaven is your home, because it is. Well, let's go, and we're going to start back in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, and we're just going to work through a few verses and talk about these things that he says. He says, first of all, put to death. This death and life metaphor keeps coming up, right? He says that you have died with Christ. You've died with Christ. Your soul has died with him, that sinful self, but you've been made a new image, a new creation in his image. But we are still in these meat sacks that are full of sin. And he says, you have to do to your bodies what was done by Jesus to yourself. You have to put those things to death. Right? We got some friends that keep having problems with bed bugs. They had problems with bed bugs, and so what they did is they got out of the house for 2 or 3 days. They had these people come in, and they bring in this giant oven truck, basically, and they heat up the house, and they heat the house up to like 150 degrees for several hours at a time, and you just cook them to death. That's what you have to do that. But it doesn't get them all. And so what you have to do once you've cooked the house is you have to come back in, and then you have to take all the clothes and all the sheets and everything where they might have hidden, and you have to run it through the dryer at really high heat to try to kill the rest of them. And what Paul is saying here is Jesus has backed the oven truck up to your house, and he's killed everything, but you still have bed bugs that you got to deal with. And if you're going to live like heaven is home, you've got some places you've got to go through, and you've got to pull this stuff out, and you've got to put it to death. Because although your home is secure, you've still got bed bugs that you've got to deal with. You've got stuff in your flesh. You have to put it to death. This is not you need to be really sorry when you sin. This is not you need to try really hard not to sin, but if you do, he said you've got to grab that sin by the throat and you've got to choke it to death. Because people whose home is heaven don't indulge in these things. What do we have to put to death? Sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry. Those are the ones that we're going to focus on today. And the reason that we're going to focus on those today is because I can't go through the entire chapter, so we're going to start where he started. But when he starts with this, he starts with them with this idea of home. And he lists these things that are all going to be a problem for them, not just because they're a sinful problem, but because all these things are a regular part of their culture. And if they're going to deal with their sin, they have to start dealing with the things that everybody else finds acceptable. First is sexual immorality. Now this is the Greek word porneia. It's a big category. This covers anything outside of a respectful marriage. That's what that is. Anything that happens outside of a man and a woman being kind to each other, outside of that, anything outside of that relationship. That's what that is. He said, you have to avoid all of that. And he doesn't go into specifics on this. Other places he does go into specifics, and he lists the different kinds of sexual immorality. But here he says you have to put to death sexual immorality. Why does he just focus on that? Because sexual immorality for them was not just something you did when nobody was watching. It was not just something of a boss and a secretary. It is not just those things. Sexual immorality was a huge part of the way they interacted in their culture. Specifically, let's talk about 2 different aspects of this. You've got the worship of Aphrodite and the worship of Bacchus. Okay, those are 2 different things, and we're going to focus on. There's a bunch more of that stuff, but this is what we're going to focus on. Aphrodite is the goddess of love, the goddess of fertility. And the way that you worship Aphrodite is you go and you hire a priestess and rent her services for a while, and that's how you worship. So let's say that you are a young couple that's having trouble getting pregnant. You don't go to the doctor. You go to the temple of Aphrodite. And the husband goes in, he engages in some services there, and he come back, and the expectation is now you're going to get pregnant. So that's the worship of that. That's how all that works, just to keep it as PG as possible. Now you say, well, it's really easy to just not go sleep with a prostitute. Like, you just don't go do it. It's really simple to not do that. But I want you to be in this situation. Think about this situation for a minute. Let's say that you are a young couple who is raised in this culture and you've both become believers, but you're having a hard time getting pregnant. And you're like, we're not going to go to this temple. But both grandmas are saying, why do I not have grandkids yet? Why do I not have grandkids yet? Just go take care of this. You know how to take care of this. Your cousin Sally, she did this. She couldn't get pregnant, and her husband went to the Temple of Artemis, got it all worked out, and then they had kids soon after that. Why are you not giving me grandkids? Why don't you want to have grandkids? Why does this religion insist that you not have kids? What's the problem? And you have to resist the pressure while enduring the pain of not having children when everybody else says there's a solution. And they don't think of it as having an affair. They don't think of it as wrong. There's nobody in the culture that's saying, don't do this. Instead, the entire culture is saying, what's wrong with you? Why don't you just go? Why don't you just get it taken care of? Now, let's say that you're not a young couple that's both believers, but let's say that you're a man that's come to Christ, you were already married, and your wife is still a pagan. And you can't have kids. And she's saying, why are you keeping kids from me? All you have to do is go to the temple of Aphrodite, go down there and worship for a little while, and then we'll be able to have kids. It worked for my cousin. It worked for our neighbor. It'll work for me. Why don't you want me to have kids? Why won't you give me children? Just go take care of it. And everything in the culture says this is the right thing to do. And Paul says, this world is not your home. And that's not how we do things. And you read this, put to death sexual immorality, you're like, yeah, of course you do. It is not that simple. Let's talk about Bacchus. Bacchus is the god of wine. He's the god of revelry. And when you would have the worship of Bacchus, it was called a bacchanal. If you remember back in the Olympics, when they said they weren't portraying the Lord's Supper, but they did it anyway, what they said that they were doing is they were portraying a bacchanal. And a bacchanal starts off with a feast where everybody gets drunk, and the hallmark of a bacchanal is breakdown of societal norms. Any rules that they are go out the window. And the way that you worship him, the way that you get what you need from him, is by breaking as many as the normal rules of society as possible. So you have this party, and you worship him by just turning all of it into everybody with everybody in whatever way that you can think of. Like, okay, well, just don't worship Bacchus. It's not a big problem, okay? But culture and religion are not separate. So your boss says, hey, having a bacchanal at the house, we're going to have a party, everybody's coming over. I want you to meet some people. I'm going to have some clients there that we really want to pick up. We want to get some sales off these people, and so I'm really going all out. I need you to be there. I need you to be there. And the thing is, you can't go for the food and then leave, because that's insulting. That's rude. So you have to decide, am I going to go to this thing like my boss is telling me to? Am I going to get these clients, or am I going to lose my job? Because if I go, I have to go and go all out. Because that's what this is for. If I'm not doing that, I'm going to be rude. So what do? Do you go and just understand that it's part of doing business and it's the way it is? Or do you live like heaven is your home? Paul is not writing to a group of people and saying, stop sleeping with your secretary. He's writing to a group of people and saying, this is not your home. And the standards that you follow have to be the standards of your home and not of this place. And when I was growing up, which I don't think was that long ago, but I'm sure Deidre and Chase feel like it was a long time ago. But when I was growing up, society was helping me, right? Society helped me with that, because society looked at all these things that we think of as wrong, and they were like, yes, these are wrong. That's the way it was. Y'all remember when Bill Clinton got impeached for having an affair? It was for lying, but it was for having an affair. You remember that? Y'all remember the days when a politician couldn't get elected if he'd been divorced? Y'all remember that? It wasn't that long ago. I remember when Ellen DeGeneres walked into the bedroom with that woman and immediately got canceled. I remember that. It wasn't that long ago. And society said, yes, we're all on board with that, even if it's just lip service to it. Society and culture were all helping me with that. But my children and your children, and many of you are not growing up in that society. You are not growing up, and you are not living, and you are not functioning in a society that supports Christian values, that acts like it. We're not doing that anymore. We don't even know which ones are boys and which ones are girls. Much less whether you're supposed to sleep with your wife or sleep with somebody else. Like, we don't know anymore as a society, and we have to set our own standards. And maybe this isn't a problem for you. Maybe you're old enough you don't care what anybody else thinks. But your children, your grandchildren, the kids that are back there right now, the teenagers that are in this room right now are growing up in a society where they are having to make decisions about whether heaven will be their home, whether they're going to live like heaven is their home, or if they're going to do what everybody else says is acceptable. And this matters for us. You may think, this isn't a big deal. I'm just not going to sleep with anybody that's not my wife. It's not a big deal. But we have to focus on this because schools are not doing it for us anymore. They're not doing it for us anymore. Y'all remember the fight when George Bush was president about whether abstinence was going to stop being taught in schools? Y'all remember that? That was the president fighting this fight. We're not doing that anymore. Nobody out there is going to teach your kids to live like heaven is their home. Nobody out there is going to teach your grandkids to live like heaven is their home. The things they look at on their phones are not teaching them that heaven is their home. You have to do that, or it's not going to be done. We have to do that, or it's not going to be done. And Paul says to people who are living in a culture very similar to what ours is becoming, is heaven your home? Because if so, that means that you're going to have to sacrifice some things at work. You're going to have to sacrifice some things personally to live in a culture that is not your home while knowing where your home is. Sexual immorality has to be put to death. Then he says impurity. Now, what is impurity? Impurity is being dirty on the inside while being being righteous on the outside. So he's talking to the Greeks, and this is a church that's biracial. You got Gentiles and you got Jews. And he's saying to the Gentiles, look, I know you've grown up in this society. I know this is how you've been, but you've got to step away from that. And the Jews are like, yeah, you do. Well, we don't do that stuff. Like, we don't go to those parties. We have our own culture. We're fine. Y'all really need to get that together. And he says, no, hang on. Because your whole culture is not built on sex the way that there is. Your whole culture is built on looking good without changing anything on the inside. And he says, as much as you have to put to death these things that are outwardly or out there that culture finds acceptable, you have to put to death this hypocrisy on the inside that allows you to be just as filthy as them without anybody knowing about it. You can't just point fingers at those people that are living out in the world and are struggling with this. You have to look at yourself. Because the sin that's just on the inside that never comes out is just as foreign to someone whose heaven is home as the sexual immorality that they're dealing with. You have to grab it and you have to put it to death. That sin that nobody knows about, that sin that's only on the inside, the sin that's just thoughts and feelings, and you got to grab it and you got to kill it. Passion and evil desire, I'm going to put those two together. That's why they're the same color. I don't know if you can figure that out or not. Passion and evil desire, because these are two sides of the same coin, or really they're the same application. Passion, this is the word pathos. It's where we get the word pathological from. It's obsession. And evil desire is the same thing. They're both obsession that drives you to behavior. But the difference is that passion is sexual and evil desire is non-sexual. So he says, not only do you have to put to death this behavior, not only do you have to put together just the fantasizing and the enjoying and doing the same things in your heart that they're doing out there, but you have to put together these evil passions that are driving you to this behavior in the first place. You can't just kill the bed bugs. You have to go after the eggs that are sprouting into new bed bugs. this behavior that leads you to this. Now, some of you are already really uncomfortable with a number of times that I've said that word, so let's talk about the evil desire instead of the passion part of it, okay? None of us struggle with desires that are so strong they lead us to sinful actions, right? None of us do that. All of us are under control. None of us would want Trump to win so badly that we would lose relationships over it, right? None of us would be so obsessed with politics and what we want to see happen in the world. And we're trusting in the government to get things done. None of us would say offensive things on Facebook. None of us would post offensive things. None of us would do offensive things because we're so obsessed with this election that it would cause us to lose an opportunity to share the gospel, right? None of us have evil desires. None of us have that controlling passion that leads us to there, right? None of us want that, drive around these neighborhoods in Bentonville and want that house so bad that we'll do whatever it takes at work to get that raise, to get that bonus, so that we can get that house or we can get that luxury truck we're driving around in. Like, none of us would do that, right? None of us would want that bonus or that promotion so bad that we miss our children's childhoods. Right? None of us would want that thing so bad that we put ourselves so in debt that we can't afford to meet our obligations, we can't afford to be generous, we can't afford to help people, can't afford to give to the church, because we want that thing so bad that we've run ourselves into such debt that we cannot breathe. None of us would do that, right? There's no problems with evil desires here, right? Those evil desires, those passions, that pathos, that pathological obsession with whatever it is that you're chasing after that leads you into sin has to be put to death. Because people whose home is heaven are controlled by the Holy Spirit, by Jesus, are obsessed with the priorities of the kingdom of God, keep their minds on upward things, not on the things here. Buy the house, buy the car, I don't care. But don't miss what matters to get something that doesn't matter, because you're trying to fulfill this desire in you that's controlling you and driving you to get something that you think is going to fix what's broken in you. Paul says you have to put that to death. And covetousness, which is idolatry. If you were to make a list of the first sins that you need to address, sexual immorality would probably make the list. I don't know that impurity might make the list, especially if I made a case for it, it might make the list. Evil desires that control you and lead you into sin, you could probably put that on the list. But covetousness, like wanting something somebody else has, doesn't seem like something I would put on the list. Does it seem like something you'd put on the list? Paul says it's important. It's important. Its first list needs to be put to death. Let's talk about why. What is covetousness? Coveting is valuing a thing over a person. That's what that is. Now, that thing might be a person. You want them for something. You might want that truck. You might want that house. You might want that promotion. You might want that status. I don't know what it is, but it's a thing that you want, and you want it enough that you're willing to sacrifice them or somebody else to get it. Covetousness is valuing a thing that you desire over a person. Why is that idolatry? Why does he say covetousness is idolatry? Covetousness is idolatry because when you sacrifice to get something, when you sell out everybody else to get something, when you turn over everything else to get something, you are worshiping that thing. You say, I don't care about anybody else, I'm going after that. I don't care who gets hurt, they got in the way, I want this. That is worship. Let's go back to Adam and Eve. What did they do? Snake said, God's lying to you. Eat from that fruit. It's good. He's just trying to keep something from you. There's a thing that you want, and if you eat this fruit, you're going to get it. Just take it and eat it. He's lying to you. He's trying to keep that from you. So she reached and she took to get the thing that she wanted. She worshiped her desires. She worshiped the thing that she wanted for herself over God, because she said, I don't care about how the relationship with God's going to go. I don't care about how this is going to hurt him. I don't care what this says about him. I care about getting what I want. And she worshiped her own desires over him. And we do the same thing. When we covet that thing, we want that thing, we want that role, we want that job, we want that person, and we don't care what it takes to get it. That is idolatry, because it's worship of the thing you're after over the one who said no. Paul says, look, y'all are obsessed with making sure you worship at the right holiday and that you eat the right kind of food and that, there's been no blood in it, you drained all the blood. You're obsessed with making sure that you do all these things, check all these boxes. But those are the wrong things to be focused on. Instead, you got to be focused on this. Where is your home? What is acceptable behavior for your home? And you don't live like these people here because you're not from here. You live like they live there. And that requires you to take some serious steps. You've got to grab a hold of these things and put them to death. You've got to grab a hold of the sexual immorality that the world says is completely acceptable, that it's not a big deal. You've got to grab a hold of that, and you've got to strangle it. You've got to put it to death, because it will destroy you. The interior sin that you hide from everybody else, that nobody else knows about you, is as dangerous to you as the exterior sin that everybody else sees. You got to kill it. Obsessive desires, and the desire is not necessarily sinful, but the obsessive desire, the desire that's so strong that it leads you to sinful behavior, is something you've got to get a handle on. You got to put it to death. And chasing after something else, so much so that you're willing to sacrifice your family, your kids, your wife, your job, your church, your relationship with God. You're willing to sacrifice all those things to get them. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter how good for the world it might be. It doesn't matter how beneficial it might be for your family. If you're willing to sacrifice people and what God has to say about those people in order to get it, it needs to be put to death. On account of all these things, the wrath of God is coming. These are the sins that are leading to the destruction of the world. These are the sins that lead to death. And we can't live like we can't have our home in heaven, but then keep living like everybody else. We can't do the thing that we've been saved from and be okay with it. We have to live as if heaven is our home. We have to be separate in how we behave. Wear that razorback while you eat your fish and chips. Live in the world, but understand where your home is. In these two, you once walked while you were living in them. They've been put to death. So what do we do with this? Well, we're going to be going through this for the next few weeks, and so I'm going to give you some different advice about practical suggestions about how to deal with these things. We're going to be doing that. But for this week, I just want to give you two pieces of advice. I want to challenge you to do two different things. The first thing I want to challenge you to do is to pay attention. How often do you end up in the middle of sin and you didn't choose to be there? You just weren't paying attention to what was going on, and all of a sudden you're there. Pay attention to what's going on around you. Pay attention to what's going on inside of you. We're talking about temptation with the teenagers right now, and it's interesting how this lines up. We talked about dealing with temptation, and what most of us want to do is endure temptation. Like, I'm just going to sit next to the temptation. I had an intern once that she, probably an eating disorder, but she would take these foods that she wasn't supposed to eat, desserts, whatever, and she would chew it up and spit it out. She would try to get all the flavor without any of the consequences. And that's what we like to do with sin, right? We like to endure the sin, get as close as we can to the fire without actually getting burnt. And I'm going to challenge you instead to do what we teach the teenagers to do, and that is to flee temptation. Rather than getting as close as you can, When you see it, move away from it. So I'm going to encourage you this week to just pay attention. Watch what's happening to you when that leads you into sin. Watch the compromises that you make. Watch the mood that you're in and how it affects you. Because those things that are leading you into sin are the things that are going to have to be dealt with. The first step to dealing with this is paying attention. And here's the second thing I want to ask you to do this week. When you see yourself drifting into those sins, when you see yourself just kind of easing into those things, remember where your home is. When John and Megan came to our house and we ordered pizza and there was no nacho cheese, they didn't have to think about whether this was strange or not. They knew it was strange right off the bat. When Eileen didn't have the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, she didn't have to think, is this right or not? She knows that at home, this is how we do things, and this is not right. And we have to remember where our home is. And if you will do what Paul said and set your mind on upward things where Jesus is seated, if you'll set your mind on heaven, if you remind yourself where home is, then this behavior won't seem normal. It won't seem acceptable. But you will know sin when you see it. So this week, here's what I challenge you to do. Pay attention and remind yourself where home is and see how things change. You who have placed your faith in Christ have died to this world, and your home is with Him. So why then do you live as if none of that happened? Your heaven is home. Your home is heaven. So let's live like it. And it will seem strange to the people around us. It will be difficult. But if Dennis can wear his Razorback internationally, no matter what's going on, we can live as if heaven is our home. Would you stand with me? Our Heavenly Father, we come before you right now, and I'm so grateful for words of Paul and the challenge that he gave to them, because this world is looking more and more like the world that the Colossians dealt with as we move forward. And we were able to get lazy for a long time, Lord. We were able to get lazy and outsource morality, outsource good behavior, outsource all these things to other people. And the government did a pretty good job of cracking down on that. The schools did a pretty good job of cracking down on that, and we got lazy. But Lord, our children and our grandchildren, the people who are growing up in our church right now, are not growing up in the world that I grew up in. They're growing up in a world where they will be encouraged to live as if this is their home. They will fight battles against culture that I didn't have to fight. And it is on us, Lord, to be there to help them, to make them aware of this, to be aware of it ourselves so that we're not depending on those things, so that we can raise them up to understand what it looks like to live as if heaven is your home. I ask that we would not ignore these things but pay attention to them, Lord. And for these specific things that we're dealing with today, these specific qualities that we're dealing with today, Lord, if there is impurity, if there is sexual immorality, if there are obsessive desires, if there is covetousness in the hearts of our people today, and I'm sure there is, I ask that we would not be able to ignore it or run from it, that you would put a spotlight right on it, that we would see it, that we would not ignore it, but that we would pay attention to what's going on in our own hearts. That we would remember where our home is, Lord, and that rather than getting as close to the line as we can with these things, we would flee from these things. We would put them to death in our lives. And that it would be evident to the people around us that this is not our home. And we live the way things are done at home. I ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen.